But Genesis is a wonderful book. Genesis is one of the most controversial books in the Bible. There are people on the left and the right of what Genesis means, how trustworthy is Genesis. I'm not just talking about with Genesis chapter 1 and 2 in creation. I mean, there's all types of things in Genesis, the Tower of Babel, the age of not even those pre-flood, but even post-flood. When you have people like Abraham and Isaac living well into their 100 years old. Moses living to be 120. And so Genesis is a wonderful book for us to study. Just about all of y'all, if you've been in the church very long, have had some class, whether it was in VBS or Sunday school or even adult class on Genesis. But I think it's a wonderful book for us to look at and talk about. And tonight, just like we do with all of our books, there won't be a whole lot of Bible reading tonight because we're going to be doing an introduction to the book of Genesis. And we'll get plenty of Bible going forward in our classes, and so it's going to be great. I told Brittany that we were going to be doing Genesis last night on the way to Lewisburg, and she said, "Great, we'll be there for 5 years." I said, "What?" She's like, "I didn't mean it like that." I was like, "How else could you mean it?" We won't be in Genesis for 5 years, I promise. It'll be a good study, I promise. So Genesis, it comes from the Hebrew. If you look in the Hebrew text, the first word is Bereshit, which means in the beginning. And so if you look at the Old Testament, you'll see that the Jews don't think of the first 5 books of the Bible like we do as being 5 individual books. They see it as being one book called the Torah, which means instruction or law. And so oftentimes the Jews themselves would break these down into 5 different sections. These 5 different sections would be known by the first word of the section. And so Genesis was known as Bereshit, which means in the beginning, which of course in our English versions, that is still kept there, in the beginning, right? God made the heavens and the earth. And so we still keep that format. But when the Greek-speaking Jews got further and further away from Palestine, and they got further and further away from Jerusalem, their main language was no longer Hebrew. Their main language was Greek, just like most of the modern world. There were more Greek Jews living outside of Palestine than there were Palestinian Jews living inside of Palestine. And in fact, most of the ones living inside Palestine, their first language wasn't even Hebrew, it was Aramaic, which was a variation of Hebrew. It's a different type of Semitic language. And so in 270 BC, which is about how many years before Christ was born? 270, right? Right. So some of you got that. So about 270 years before Christ was born, in a small place called Alexandria, Egypt. Joke, not a small place. Probably one of the most significant cities of the ancient world. Alexandria, Egypt. There were 70 or 72 Jewish Greek scholars. We don't know the tradition from the letter of that is given by different people like Philo. Some name 70 translators, some name 72. But there were evidently 70 translators in Alexandria, Egypt, about 300 years before Jesus was born. And supposedly they were all given a portion of the Pentateuch. And according to history, which is probably certainly not true, but according to history, all 70 translators translated the Old Testament from Hebrew to Greek. And out of all 70 translators, they all translated it the exact same. Not a single word was different. Once again, that is legend. Probably certainly not true. But it was one of the ways that they tried to say that, it's like today. Most Muslims will tell you that if a Quran is not written in Arabic, it's not really the real Quran. Well, that was kind of the idea of what the Hebrews thought about the Hebrew Bible. And so when these Jews made the Septuagint, which was the Latin phrase for 70, Septuagint, which is the Greek 5 books of the Bible. That was kind of their way of doing that. This is important because oftentimes when Jesus and the apostles quote from the Old Testament and the New Testament, they're actually quoting from the Septuagint. And I've got one in my office, and I should have brought it. I meant to bring it out here, but I just forgot. But it's the Septuagint technically is the first 5 books of the Bible in Greek. Although you can call the whole Old Testament in Greek the Septuagint. It's really Old Greek Bible. It's really the technical. It doesn't matter. Anyways, and if you look in the book of Genesis, this is where we get our term Genesis from. This is from the first word Genesis, which means birth or point of origin or ancestry. And when Jerome made the Latin Vulgate in the 400s, and he took from the Latin Bible, he borrowed the names from the Greek Bible and not the Hebrew Bible. And so the English Bibles later on, about 1,000 years later after Jerome, would continue this. And so Jerome took the titles from the Greeks. We took the titles from Jerome, which is why you call your Bible Genesis and not Bereshit. Right? And so if anybody asks you why the Bible is called Genesis, you can just say, because it's from the Greek Old Testament, right? Not the Hebrew. And so that may have been more than what you wanted to know, but I apologize. And so this was written by Moses. And so Moses lived about 1525 to 1405 BC. How many years is that before Christ? About 1,525 years before Christ to about 1,405 years before Christ, right?
We're assuming a 0 year.
If we're assuming is
the third or fourth year previous birth.
That's correct. We're just going to say easy, and we're going to keep it at 0. If you ask me for my personal opinion, I believe Jesus was probably born in 4 BC, 4 to 6 BC. And so, but it messes a lot of things up because it messes our entire dating system up. We've got to start telling people that the church wasn't established in AD 33, that it was established in AD 29, and it messes up paintings and books, and we just can't do that. So we're just sticking with 0, okay? All right. That didn't offend anybody, did it?
No.
Okay. There was a monk, okay, a medieval monk that counted back. He was like over 1,000 years removed, and he missed it by like 4 years, which is amazing. I mean, we're talking about a time before computers, when you had to track down all of your stuff, where people dated things by the reigns of kings, and this guy made a history going back over 1,000 years and was off for like 4 years. I mean, it's amazing what it was. I mean, it really is, but that's true. That is probably 4 to 6 BC. Anybody know why we know that? Why it's probably 4 to 6? King Herod. All right. Okay. You can't just... You're doing great. What about King Herod? Well, King Herod died.
The transition of the monarchy in Rome at that time. King Herod died roughly 4 or 6 BC, and the other Herod picked up, which is about the time that Egypt would have released Christ, and he would come back into the Holy Land.
All right, building off what Billy Wayne said, we can kind of bookmark 2 events, right? We read in the very beginning pages of the Gospels that Jesus' family, Joseph and Mary, came to Bethlehem because of a census, right? The census of Cornelius, right? That happened in 6 BC. We know that Herod tried to kill all the baby boys, right? King Herod, when did he die? 4 BC. So you got 2 bookends between 6 and 4. And so you kind of got a little time frame right there that kind of narrows it where it has to be. And so, but that's enough on the dating system. So, but if you didn't know that, you can go home tonight and tell your kids, did y'all learn something in your Bible classes tonight? And they say, no. You can say, we did. Isaac's the best, and he deserves to be at teacher appreciation. Because last year we had Demas's, and I'm hoping we have it again. Anyways, if you haven't taught before, you too can get a free catered meal by Demas's or the like. But you got to teach first. All right. Or get your spouse to teach, you know. So 2 of the most disputed aspects of the book of Genesis comes down to 2 things, and that is Mosaic authorship and the creation account. And we all know the fact that Genesis, especially chapters 1 through 11, have been hammered by scientists and evolutionists and theistic evolutionists for quite some time about the creation account in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. And we'll get to that next week and in subsequent weeks as we look at Genesis chapter 1, 2, and Genesis chapter really through 11, where it talks about the flood and the Tower of Babel and all types of stuff like that. But the other thing that most people aren't aware of is the actual most disputed thing about Genesis that is even disputed among people in the church is Mosaic authorship. For a long time, if you'd have said, well, Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, it would have been a very offensive thing to say. But there are many people in the church today, and even who teach at universities, that will say, Moses probably didn't write Genesis. Well, I would like to address this a little bit later on as to who wrote Genesis and why we know that.
Deuteronomy and Christ giving authentication to.
You're jumping ahead, man. You're jumping ahead. You're stealing my thunder, Billy Wayne. Calm down.
Sorry.
But you're doing great, though. I mean, honestly, you're doing fantastic. All right, so Mosaic authorship. All right, was he qualified? Well, for a long time, there were scholars who would say, Moses just couldn't have written the Pentateuch because Moses couldn't write. People couldn't even write, 1500 BC. And for years, there were critical scholars that said, you guys are so stupid. You think Moses wrote the Pentateuch? People couldn't even write back then.
He was raised in Pharaoh's palace.
Well, they would say people didn't write at all back then. The Egyptians were using hieroglyphs at that time, but there was no written language. Well, lo and behold, we have a couple archaeological discoveries take place in the Middle East. And lo and behold, they're writing 1,000 years before Abraham. Whoa. Before Moses. That guy too. And so eventually they had to remove this argument. It was, people couldn't even write back in Moses' day. That's just dumb, isn't it? Well, lo and behold, they could write. And so was he qualified? Well, he had the right heritage. He was from Mesopotamia, which was where writing was taking place at this time. He had the right cultural background. He was from Egypt, one of the most affluent cultures in the ancient world. Also being raised in Pharaoh's house, he obviously would have been an extremely educated individual. Even in Egypt, the toilets had writing on them. I mean, that's, your culture can write pretty good if you got writings on the toilets. And so it was the right time. You're like, well, I mean, that's 5 books of the Bible. That's a pretty good swath of writing right there. Well, dude was in the wilderness for 40 years. I mean, he had some time on his hands to kill. And number 4, he had the motivation. He believed God was establishing a nation. And of course, we believe the fact that Moses was an inspired writer of the Bible. And so, of course, Moses meets the qualifications of someone who could have written the law. And so we're going to carry that idea a little bit forward and talk about Mosaic authorship. And so what is the evidence for Moses being the author of the Pentateuch? And I think this is very important because there are lots of people, like I said, even in Christian universities or even in schools, that will deny the fact that Moses is the writer of the Pentateuch. So I think this is very important. The number one reason why we know that Moses wrote the Pentateuch is because of Old Testament evidences and testimony. We can look inside the Pentateuch itself. What is the Pentateuch? First 5 books of the Bible, right? Penta means 5. So that's kind of your key right there, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And so inside the Pentateuch, we can see commands where Moses is told by God to write things down, like in Exodus 17:14, Exodus 24:4-7, Exodus 34:27, Numbers chapter 33, 1 and 2, Deuteronomy 31, 9 and 11. But we also have witnesses outside the Pentateuch. And when I say outside the Pentateuch, what am I talking about? Well, all the books that's not the first 5 books of the Bible, right? So going all the way from Joshua to Malachi. And so Joshua talks about the copy of the law that Moses had written down in Joshua 8:32, 34, and 35. The commandments given through Moses and the things written in the law of Moses are frequently mentioned throughout the Bible. 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, Malachi, and more. And so there's numerous testimony both inside the Pentateuch and outside the Pentateuch that Moses is the author. But one of the strongest ones for me, being a believer of the inspiration of the Bible, especially the inspiration of the New Testament and the inspiration of Christ, is the witnesses of the New Testament. And so often Jesus cites the Pentateuch during his earthly ministry, and he attributes the Pentateuch being written by Moses. He says that in Matthew chapter 8, verse 4, Matthew 19:4, Matthew 19:7 and 8, and Mark chapter 1, verse 44, and Mark 7:10, and Mark 12:26, and he goes on and on, especially in John 5:45 and John 5:46. And so many people will say, well, we just don't know who wrote the Pentateuch. Well, if you believe Jesus is the Son of God, who knew what he was talking about, he kind of makes it easy for us. And so since I tend to be in that camp, I tend to affirm Mosaic authorship. But there was also the apostles, and New Testament writers also credit Moses with referring to him as being the writer of the Pentateuch, like in Acts chapter 15:21, Acts 26:22, Acts 28:23, Romans 10:5, 1 Corinthians 9:9, Hebrews 10:28, and there are other testimonies inside the New Testament that talk about Moses being the writer of the Pentateuch. The third reason why we can believe that Moses is the author of the Pentateuch is extra-biblical witness and testimony. Now, when I say extra-biblical, what am I talking about there?
World history.
That's right. World history, writers outside the Bible, anything that comes from outside the Bible, like Syriac in 24:23, 2 Maccabees 7:6, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha, Philo, Josephus, and rabbis and the church fathers. And so Mosaic authorship is assumed by everyone, Jew, Gentile, and Christian, for 3,500 years, almost 4,000 years. And then some really smart people came around in the 1700s and said, oh, Moses couldn't have written that. And that's kind of, I fancy myself to at least to know about biblical scholarship, maybe not to be a biblical scholar, but oftentimes biblical scholarship is slanted towards disproving everything and believing nothing. This comes from German higher criticism. Number 4, eyewitness details. And so there are things that are mentioned. People would say, well, Moses didn't write the Pentateuch. It was probably written in the 500s when the Jews were trying to establish themselves as God's people. They probably had some writings down of their forefathers that talked about the law of Moses and that talked about, the law written to Moses and the books according to Moses. And they sat down and they made this masterful 5-book Torah Pentateuch that they started to believe in. But the problem that is, there are so many eyewitness details that it seems like only somebody would know that takes place. I mean, I guess you could say that there were, fanciful storytellers, but there are eyewitness details that we can go and attribute for actually in these places, like in Exodus 19:18, Exodus 16:31, Numbers chapter 11, verses 7 through 8, the order of the encampment, Numbers chapter 2, the toponyms of the wilderness, the names of defeated kings in Deuteronomy chapter 3. How could someone living 500 to 1,000 years later know these things? Things that have only recently been uncovered by archaeology to proven to be true. And so it seems pretty slanted that it would have been somebody at least who was there and witnessed these things. The acquaintance with Egypt. If these were individuals that were writing 500 years later in Palestine, if this was something that was going on, during the Davidic kingdom when they were trying to establish themselves as a nation and a capital with a capitalized religion, there seems to be too many things that somebody super familiar with Egypt would have known, like the names Pithom, or House of Atum, or Potipharia, the Bowman of Ra. There's a larger percentage of Egyptian words in the Pentateuch than anywhere else in the Bible. And so if you say, well, Egypt was a very powerful and influential place, just like you can go to India today. Anybody ever seen an Indian movie, like where they speak in like Telugu or something? Have you ever seen that? I don't know why you would, but like you'll be listening to somebody talking in Indian, and you'll hear like random American words just like thrown in there, just like at random. Anybody ever witnessed that? Something? No? Okay, never mind. All right. Well, if you go around the world, most languages say okay. Like they'll say okay. There's a certain, why? Because America is the powerfulest country on earth. We have a certain influence and our language gets around. Somebody will say, well, yeah, there's a lot of Egyptian words there, but that doesn't mean that Moses, who was raised in Egypt in Pharaoh's house, would have written that. Egypt was one of the leading powers of the world, and surely they would have had some, Egyptian names in their language. Well, the problem is you have a larger percentage of Egyptian words in the Pentateuch than anywhere else in the Bible. And so it seems like it would be more probable with someone with a heavy Egyptian background. Well, of course, it's hard to find a character in the Bible that has a more Egyptian background than Moses. And so in Exodus 9:31 through 32, the seasons are in Egyptian and not Canaanite order. Failure to name Pharaoh's names in the 9th century BCE was common. And so it's interesting there. The next thing is archaic customs and words. And so the wife-sister motif, there's a Nuzi archive which dates to about the 15th century, which would have been about the time that Moses probably would have written this. The prenuptial agreements are also in the Nuzi archives. And the validity of oral and deathbed testaments and the price of slaves in Genesis 37 all point back to things that we have uncovered through archaeology that date to the time of Moses and not to the time of David like some would do. And also there is a word that is used for she in the Pentateuch. It's used over 100 times. I realize this is probably boring you guys to death, but this is pretty cool. She is a pretty common pronoun both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, because when you talk about things, you say he, she quite a bit. If you notice in your daily life, you use pronouns quite a bit. Well, in the Pentateuch, the Egyptian, the archaic older form, which is influenced by Egyptian, is used over 100 times in the Pentateuch. It is only used 3 times in the rest of the Bible. And so, when you think about the Pentateuch is a good portion, but those 5 books of the Bible versus the rest of the Old Testament, and you have it 100 times in the Pentateuch, only 3 times in the rest of the Old Testament, it points to it being a much older book and structure. And so, and if Moses did write the Pentateuch, then it is by far the oldest written book that we have in the Old Testament, probably by quite a bit. And so, those are the reasons why I would suggest that we have Mosaic authorship. Old Testament testimony, New Testament testimony, extra-biblical testimony, eyewitness details, acquaintance with Egypt, and archaic customs, and even archaic language that takes place. It's not just the pronoun she, but that's probably the heaviest one. There's also some more like Na'ar and Kesev. Any questions so far on Mosaic authorship?
You've also got the ancient custom of the Caesarean covenant that Abraham undergoes with God, where God passes through instead of Abraham.
Yeah.
Putting him at liability.
Yeah.
If the covenant was broken.
The Caesarean covenant is a covenant that takes place between a king or a deity, between someone who's lower. It's not a covenant between 2 equals, right? And so, and you see that with Abraham and God, and the splitting the cows in half. So, good. Anybody else? Anybody have any questions on Mosaic authorship? Can anybody think of any passages that may be difficult if Moses is the author of the Pentateuch? Why someone would think that Moses didn't write it? If Moses wrote the Pentateuch in Deuteronomy 34, which is in the Pentateuch, it's the last chapter of the Pentateuch, and it talks about Moses' death and God burying him. Who wrote that? Did Moses write about his own death before his death? It's a good question, and since you didn't ask about it, we're not going to talk about it, because evidently I don't care enough. Yeah, I mean, the best guess is that Joshua probably wrote it. If Joshua writes Joshua, or even if Joshua didn't write Joshua, you could have Joshua finishing out. Moses talks about God raising up a prophet after him. I think that's an allusion to Jesus. Of course, New Testament writers believe that's an allusion to Jesus. But you also have double fulfillment, which means a prophecy can be done twice. And so, Joshua probably is the one that does Deuteronomy 34.
Joshua immediately steps into position. Christ steps into position thousands of years later.
That's right. And so you get that double fulfillment of the prophecy. There's also another one in Numbers that is a little hard to explain. Anybody know that one in Numbers? I think it's in chapter 12. Anybody? You guys are going to have to read your Pentateuch this week. Get caught up to speed. There's a passage that says something like, Moses, he was the most humble man that ever lived. Who wrote the Pentateuch? Moses. Does that sound like something the most humble man that would ever live would say? Yeah. And so, the obvious answer is he wrote it through inspiration. That this is the Holy Spirit talking through Moses. I don't mean to be, it's just funny. It is funny to read that by Moses' hand. Moses, the most humble man that ever lived. Cecil.
What are the scholars' alternative to Moses?
The leading alternative to Moses writing this, the theory that would be suggested by scholars, is the documentary hypothesis, which is a little deeper than this class is wanting to go. But they say that there were 4 different documents. There was J, E, P, and D, right? And so there were 4 different documents that the Israelites used that developed over time, originally from oral histories that both got kind of passed down. And you kind of had the historical history, and then you kind of had the religious history, and then you kind of had like the priestly history. And then in about 1000 AD, 1000 BC, when the temple was being built, and they were needing to have kind of a unified codiceed thing, to get people in line to worship one God and all this jazz, that they came together, blended these documents together to one document called the Torah, the law, the instruction. This was then edited over the next 500 years. And so it was put together in 1000, edited for 500 years until its final form, probably around 400 or so BC. That's what the scholarly alternative would say. There's no evidence for any of that. It's just a hypothesis that was put forth by Julius Wellhausen in the early 18th century. But it's been adopted, by many scholars. It's been rejected. It's been changed a lot, but that's kind of where we're at right now. Great question, though.
But there's never been any scrolls or anything.
No, there's no evidence whatsoever at all to ever suggest that was the case, or that the Pentateuch was ever that Moses wrote it.
It showed Moses wrote it. There's no scrolls, right?
No, you mean like there's no written, like when you say there's no scrolls, you mean like the scrolls that Moses wrote, or are you saying?
Find those,
Can we find the scrolls that Moses wrote? Probably not, because they're 3,500 years old, and so they were written on probably papyrus scrolls, and so 3,500 years is just too long for something like that to survive.
Even if they short little pieces.
Yeah. So, good question. Right. And even if we found the originals, there's no way to do like a handwritten analysis to say if this was, we don't have anything by like Moses' hand to say, all right, are these cues Moses' cues? Like the line curves at the end, this one doesn't, so we wouldn't, even if we had the original slap us in the face, we would be like, I don't know, I don't know if these are it or not. And so, but good question. And the Toledoth, when you look at the outline of Genesis, man, our time is so gone. There are 10 Toledoths in Genesis. The first of which doesn't talk about a person, but says these are the Toledoth, or these are the narrative or the genealogy of the heavens and the earth. And 2:4. And then you have 9 more throughout the book of Genesis. And you have it before Adam, Noah, the sons of Noah, Shem, Terah, Ishmael, Isaac, there's an H missing, I know that, Esau, and Jacob. And so, not the same thing as genealogies, but these are more like the generations of, like these are the story, if you will, of these people. Anybody notice a gaping hole in that list of men? Well, it's got Adam and Noah, but there's somebody missing that you would think would be there. Abraham, right? It's missing from there. But he gets a genealogy. So this is different. But if you look at the structure, the breakdown of Genesis, it is interesting to see these 10 Toledoth. And so here you have these narrative elements. And we're going to wind up pretty soon. And I apologize for taking too much time with jokes and things. But if you look at Genesis and look at the time breakdown, it's pretty interesting. There's a clear and a sharp divide between chapter 11 and chapter 12. In chapters 1 through 11, which is 20% of the book of Genesis, we have 20 generations. And then we kind of zoom in, and we have 80% of the book focused on 4 generations of one family between chapters 12 and 50. And even then, you can see there's a separation between where these things take place. And so in chapters 1 through 11, 20% of the book, we're in Babylon. And then for chapters 12 through 36, we're in Palestine. And then through chapters 37 through 50, we're in Egypt. And so you kind of have these 3 epicenters of the Jewish race: Babylon, then to Palestine, then to Egypt. And then you can see a kind of breakdown of the human characters. And so 1 through 11, you have the ancestors of all nations. This is all of our ancestors. And then verses 12 through 50, you have the ancestors of Israel. And so in chapters 1 through 11, which is 20% of the book, you have Adam and Noah and all the generations of humanity before the Tower of Babel. But in chapter 12 through 25, you have Abraham. And 25% of the book is dedicated just to Abraham. 25% of the book is dedicated to just Jacob. But how much percent is to Joseph? 30%. Now don't lie. How many of you tonight, if I'd have asked, who gets the most portion in Genesis? Like which character gets more written about him in Genesis than any other character? How many of you would have said Joseph? How many would have said Abraham? Most of us, right? But Joseph is the one who actually gets more written about him in the book of Genesis than any other character. And so, one of those extra things you learned tonight, right? So in the plot, chapters 1 through 11, the real focus is on creation, on sin, on the consequences of our actions. And then in chapters 12 through 50, there's tons of motifs, but really the narrative elements are divine promises, the covenants that God makes with Abraham and his offspring, human weakness. I mean, when you read the book of Genesis, I mean, you see, from Abraham, the forefather of the faith, all the way to Joseph. People have issues. People have sin. People have things that they do that they shouldn't have done. And so it kind of shows you the humanity of us all. It shows about faith and the power of faith. It shows divine providence and how God works for His purposes even through the failures of man. And of course the covenant, which is mentioned several times in the book of Genesis and then reiterated like in Galatians chapter 3. And so,
man, beginning of sin, beginning of salvation.
It all happens in the book of Genesis. So it's going to be a great study. It will not take 5 years. You have my word on it. It may take 4.5. No, I'm just playing. But it won't take 5 years. And are there any questions or comments tonight before we close in prayer?
No. I find it strange. Things happen so fast.
Yeah.
You start in the first chapter, and it's very, very quick, the flood.
Mm-hmm.
About 1,600 years.
Yeah.
But then the overall book covers so many generations, such a vast amount of time.
Mm.
I wonder why maybe there wasn't another book or two thrown in.
Yeah.
To give us a little more.
Well, one of the things, like you're saying, you read chapters 1 through 11, and you're like, no, I want more. Like, I want more. Like, don't move on from Noah. Like, I want more. Like, don't move on from the Tower of Babel. I want more. And there's so many details and questions. If you have an inquisitive mind, there's so many things you're like, I just wish I could, ask Noah about this, or this. Like, I just wish I could ask. And there's so many things. But you're right. It makes the mind wonder.
Another thing I wonder is why so many years passed before book was actually written.
Like why wasn't it written beforehand?
Why wasn't the book wrote earlier instead of waiting all these hundreds of years?
Yeah. Well, one way to answer that is that's a question for God. I don't know that one. The other way to answer it is need to know, right? And so one of the things that
transition time period, God was talking to the fathers of the families, the patriarchs.
Yeah.
And then you've got God talking through the law.
Well, there's all types of questions like you could ask, why wasn't Jesus sent in Abraham's day?
And I know it's all here. All we need to know is here.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder.
Well, it's like when Paul writes, he writes about what was the purpose. Because the Jews asked that question. When Paul's trying to convert them to Christianity, they say, well, if that was the case, why didn't he send Jesus and why establish a covenant with Abraham at all? Like, why did we just waste 2,500 years if that was the case? And Paul says that the reason why we had 2,500 years of a covenant and 1,500 years of the old law was to pave the way and to make ready, Galatians 4:4, the fullness of time for Jesus to come. And so it could have that global impact where in God's infinite wisdom it wouldn't have had for some reason or another if he came in 2,500 BC or not. And now why that is, we could theorize all night, but honestly, that goes above my pay grade. And so
God gives us everything that we need to know.
Need to know basis. That's right. That's right. Just like chapters 1 through 11.
We want to know, but everything we need to know.
Yeah, we'd love to know more in Genesis 1 through 11, but we don't. It's just not need to know, right? So good. Great questions. Great questions. Well, we'll go ahead and close the prayer. And thank you so much for your questions and your comments, and looking forward to our ongoing study in the book of Genesis. Let's go ahead and close the prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for all the many blessings you've given us. We're so thankful for this time we can come together during the middle of the week to be with each other in fellowship and to study your word. We're so thankful for the wisdom and the insight that it imparts. Please help us to always submit to your word, to look to it for guidance in our lives, for the church today, and also for how we can impact this world to be a more positive and a more holy place, and for individuals to live in such a way that glorifies and honors you. Please be with us and help us to take the things that we will learn through the book of Genesis and our other studies here at this congregation to help improve us as Christians and to help us walk closer with you each and every day. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.